In February of 1845, a small wooden house in Atkinson, Maine became the stage for one of the most disturbing religious gatherings in early American history. Inside, a group of fanatic believers claimed to be experiencing the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. They spoke in strange utterances, rolled on the floor, and shouted prophecies into the air. This wasn't a revival, it was chaos. At the center of it all stood a man named Israel Dammon. And among the participants, quietly observing and occasionally affirming the spiritual frenzy, was a 17-year-old girl named Ellen Harmon, the woman who would later become Ellen G. White. The event would spiral so far out of control that neighbors, frightened by the noise and behavior, called for the authorities. When officers arrived, they found men and women lying on the floor, claiming visions, refusing to leave, and in some cases physically resisting. Israel Dammon was arrested on the spot. His public trial that followed was widely reported, and eyewitnesses described a scene that looked more like a séance than a Christian meeting. The court transcript didn't just document a man's legal trouble. It exposed the early spiritual DNA of what would later evolve into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Most Adventists have never heard this story, and those who have often dismiss it as a misunderstanding or a moment of youthful zeal. But the historical record is clear. Ellen White was present, not as a random visitor, but as a believer and supporter of the group's behavior. The kind of behavior she would later describe in her own writings as heavenly manifestations. If these were truly from God, why did the civil authorities see them as dangerous? Why did the local community fear what was happening inside that home? This is not just an isolated incident buried in the past. It is the root, the origin, the spiritual foundation of a movement that claims to be God's final remnant on earth. If you want to understand who Ellen White really was, not the sanitized version taught in Sabbath school, then you must start here, with the night in Atkinson and the trial of Israel Dammon. Before we dive deeper, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you value truth over tradition, you're in the right place, and what you're about to see may challenge everything you thought you knew. Who was Israel Dammon? Israel Dammon was more than a zealous preacher. He was one of the earliest allies and spiritual influencers in Ellen Harmon's life. A devoted millwright, Dammon was known for his emotional preaching, apocalyptic urgency, and willingness to cross the line between conviction and chaos. He traveled across Maine preaching that the end of the world had come, not was coming, had come. In fact, he insisted that probation had closed, and that no one else could be saved. Those who didn't join their little group were lost forever. This radical theology was embraced not just by fringe fanatics, but by young Ellen herself, who attended Dammon's meetings and was deeply influenced by them. It wasn't just fellowship, it was formation. On February 15, 1845, in Atkinson, Maine, Dammon led a multi-day gathering that quickly spiraled into religious disorder. Eyewitnesses described men and women laying motionless on the floor for hours, wailing, shouting, and speaking in strange phrases. Others were seen in trances, being slain by the Spirit. At the center of it all was Dammon, but standing close by, silent, observant, and affirming, was Ellen Harmon. This wasn't a one-time mistake or an outsider looking in. She was part of it. And yet, decades later, not one word of this night would appear in her many inspired autobiographies. Why? Because this event didn't support the polished prophetess image the church would later build around her. It was raw, erratic, and dangerously revealing. Ellen White would later speak often about false spiritual manifestations, warning against fanaticism and confusion. But the irony is chilling. She was birthed from it. Her prophetic ministry grew from the soil of radicalism, emotionalism, and theological extremism. Her presence at Dammon's meeting wasn't incidental. It was formative. These were her roots. And if the root is rotten, how trustworthy can the fruit be? Most Adventists will never hear this part of her story in church history class. But that doesn't make it any less true. The record is public. The trial happened. The testimonies were given. Ellen White was there. And from that night forward, she would never be the same. The trial of Israel Dammon. The trial took place just days after the arrest, and what unfolded in that courtroom was nothing short of bizarre. Multiple witnesses, neighbors, officers, and even former followers, testified under oath about what they saw. People lying flat on their backs in silence for hours. Others screaming, moaning, or speaking in what they called unknown tongues. Some were told that if they left the house, they would lose their salvation. The group had declared that they were now living in the Holy City, and that Ellen Harmon, yes, the same Ellen White revered by millions today, had a divine message to guide them. And what was that message? That the door of salvation was shut for everyone outside their circle. No more conversions. No more grace. Just them, the chosen few. The arrogance was chilling. Witnesses described how Dammon acted like a spiritual dictator, controlling the group's behavior and dictating who could speak. And Ellen? She never objected. In fact, according to the trial record, she affirmed the group's authority and their extreme doctrine. This wasn't just theological experimentation. It was cult-like control, complete with emotional manipulation and spiritual elitism. The same woman who would later claim to be God's messenger was fully immersed in a gathering that bore more resemblance to fanaticism than faith. Not only did she not rebuke it, she endorsed it with her presence and silence. And silence, in moments like these, speaks volumes. The transcript of the trial remains one of the most damning historical documents connected to the early Adventist movement. It reveals a young Ellen Harmon not standing apart from deception, but surrounded by it, shaped by it, and participating in it. No vision stopped the madness. No divine message corrected the error. Nothing. And yet, from this environment, the prophetic ministry of Ellen G. White would emerge. For those who believe her writings are pure truth from heaven, this event raises a question too big to ignore. If she couldn't recognize spiritual confusion when it was right in front of her, what makes you so sure she was guided by the Holy Spirit afterward? Ellen White's silence, and her first vision. What's even more shocking than the trial itself is what came next. Just 2 months after the events in Atkinson, in December of 1845, Ellen Harmon claimed to receive her first vision from God. But here's what no one seems to notice. It didn't correct the chaos she had just witnessed. It didn't expose the false teachings of Israel Dammon. It didn't rebuke the spiritual abuse or the manipulative declarations about salvation being closed. Instead, her vision confirmed what the group had already been preaching, that a small remnant had the light, and everyone else was in darkness. Sound familiar? Rather than bringing clarity, her vision brought control. It validated the theology that Dammon had been promoting, that salvation had ended for the world, and that only the faithful few remained inside the shut door. And this wasn't a passing phase. Ellen would go on to defend the shut-door doctrine for years, claiming that it was revealed to her directly by God. She later walked it back publicly, but only after it became too controversial to maintain. This pattern of visionary correction by convenience would repeat itself throughout her ministry. And yet, even with all of this, the chaos, the arrest, the doctrinal confusion, Ellen White would eventually rise to become the most authoritative voice in Adventism. How? Because the movement needed a prophet. It needed someone to justify its failed expectations. And Ellen, shaped by spiritual extremism and affirmed by the very chaos she never questioned, was ready to fill that role. She didn't just survive Atkinson, she evolved in it. And the Adventist Church, knowingly or not, was built on top of those ruins. So let's connect the dots. Ellen Harmon witnessed emotional manipulation, unbiblical chaos, and cult-like behavior, and her reaction wasn't to rebuke it, but to spiritualize it. Just weeks later, she emerged with a vision that didn't expose the deception but endorsed it. Her first prophetic message echoed the same fanatical doctrine that got Israel Dammon arrested. And still, Adventists today speak of her as though she walked untouched through history, as if God handpicked a silent bystander of madness to declare eternal truth. But maybe silence wasn't a sign of humility. Maybe it was complicity. And maybe that first vision wasn't divine light, but psychological trauma wrapped in spiritual language. How can a prophet fail to discern falsehood when it's happening in the room? If Ellen White was truly led by God, why did her early revelations only serve to protect the confusion rather than confront it? And more importantly, if her first messages were built on a lie, why should any of her later writings be trusted? This is the uncomfortable truth most Adventists will never hear. Because once you dig into the foundation, the cracks become impossible to ignore. The shut-door theology wasn't an accident. It was the spiritual byproduct of fanaticism. And Ellen didn't just inherit it, she preached it. She used it to draw lines, to control belief, to justify exclusivity. And the church that now claims to be the final remnant was born in that very atmosphere. What if everything built on that is equally unstable? In Part 2, we're going deeper. What exactly was the shut-door doctrine? Why did Ellen White promote it as God's will, and then quietly abandon it later? And what did she really say about those who tried to convert souls after 1844? If you're ready to confront history without filters, then make sure you subscribe. And let me ask you this. Do you think Ellen White was a victim of her environment, or the architect of something more dangerous? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading everything.